In the current Israeli-Palestinian dispute over the ownership of the city of Jerusalem, the country of France has also made several claims of ownership over 4 holy sites in the city, with France's connection to Jerusalem going back at least 1,000 years. Located at the intersection of 3 continents, and as a city important to 3 major world religions, Jerusalem has seen a great deal of conflict throughout its history, with the 10th century being a particularly chaotic time. During this era, the Middle East was ruled by competing Muslim dynasties, who fought against each other, as well as the Orthodox Christian Byzantines for control of the Holy Land. Eventually, the Shia Fatimid dynasty would gain control of Jerusalem in the year 970, with the city going through a great deal of hardship during the early rule of the 6th Fatimid Caliph, Al-Hakam bin Amrallah, who, despite being born to a Christian mother, engaged in a series of persecutions against many of his Christian as well as Jewish subjects, with Al-Hakam even going so far as to level many churches and synagogues, with some estimates putting the number of destroyed houses of worship in the hundreds or even the thousands. This includes the time when the 24-year-old Al-Hakam ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem in the year 1009, with this church being an important Christian pilgrimage site as it was built over the hills where Jesus was crucified and later buried. This shocked much of the Christian world, including France, which was often referred to as the eldest daughter of the Catholic Church due to its extremely close relationship with the Vatican. Now, as anger was building across Christendom, Al-Hakam surprised many chroniclers in the Muslim world. By reversing many of his earlier actions, he allowed many churches and synagogues to be rebuilt, and even let many new Muslims, who had converted under pressure of persecution, to return to Christianity or Judaism, with the end of his reign being even more surprising and mysterious. One night, Al-Hakam simply walked out of the capital city of Cairo and disappeared, never to be seen again. He was eventually succeeded by his son, the Caliph al-Zahir, who continued his father's restoration projects by allowing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to be rebuilt in Jerusalem. Now, despite this rebuilding program, many Christians were still horrified and enraged at the desecration of their holy sites. Therefore, when a Frenchman named Otto de Legri became Pope Urban II in 1088, he used his position to rail against Islamic control of Jerusalem, with several records of his speeches, noting how he evoked the persecution of Christians, the destruction of churches, and the need to reclaim the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to motivate his Catholic followers to go on a crusade to take back the Holy City. This led many French warriors, priests, and noblemen to go to the Levant. Here they established several Crusader states around Palestine and Syria, with the siege of Jerusalem in 1099 leading to the destruction of several houses of worship, including when Crusaders burned down a synagogue filled with Jewish civilians and massacred several Muslims who were hiding on the Temple Mount. And as a result of the close relationship between church and state, in addition to military conquests, the Crusaders also began a campaign of repurposing Muslim and Jewish holy sites into Christian ones, such as the Dome of the Rock. They also began building new churches and supporting members of the local Catholic clergy, with the Crusaders also restoring and expanding several churches that had been destroyed by Al-Hakam, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, with the finished structure making up most of the building we see today. Now, even though many of these churches would survive for the next 1,000 years, the Crusader states would not, as they soon collapsed after a few generations. A couple centuries later, the Muslim Ottomans would end up conquering the region. This led the French monarchy under Francis I to establish diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Sultan by signing a capitulation treaty in 1535 or 36. This allowed for greater legal protections and economic benefits for any Frenchman who wanted to travel or do business in Ottoman lands. It also gave the French greater access to Jerusalem and its holy sites without having to go to war. And since the Vatican could not openly have direct diplomatic relations with a non-Christian power, the French acted as the Church's unofficial representatives to the Ottomans, with this treaty marking the start of the French religious protectorate. 2 centuries later, in 1740, the French were given even more power, when they were given the right to protect all Catholics in the Ottoman Empire, regardless of nationality. But over time, tensions with the Vatican, as well as other Catholic nations, began to emerge, as France's control over Ottoman Catholics and the clergy also increased, with the Vatican eventually deferring to the French in several ways. By the 1800s, they allowed Catholic priests in Jerusalem to give religious honors to French political leaders. For example, after saying a prayer in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the clergy would repeat the Latin phrase, "God save the Republic," with the Republic being the French state. And whenever the French consul would attend a religious service, he would be seated in a place of high honor, be presented holy water by the Latin Patriarch, and be given the kiss of peace, which is an ancient Christian blessing. During this era, as the number of Christian pilgrims visiting Jerusalem increased, the French began to establish a series of institutions across the Ottoman Empire. And as noted by Dr. Dominique Trimbur of the French Research Center in Jerusalem, This would include orphanages, hospitals, medical clinics, schools, buildings to host French pilgrims, and seminaries for French clerics, with this being done to help religious pilgrims and the local Catholic communities, but also to expand the influence of the French government in the region, especially as the Russian Empire began asserting their claim to be the protector of all Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, with these battles over representation and religious authority contributing to the outbreak of larger conflicts, such as the Crimean War in 1853. Now, over the course of the 1800s, even as France became increasingly secular, the French government gradually gained possession of several religious sites in and around Jerusalem, with the government claiming 4 of these sites as the national domains of France, with a national domain being a place that has historical significance to the French state. This would include the monastery of Abu Ghosh, the Tomb of the Kings, the Church of St. Anne, and the Church of the Pater Noster. In 1856, Sultan Abdul Majid I gifted the Church of St. Anne to the French, as thanks for the French helping the Ottomans in the Crimean War. The church is named after St. Anne because it is assumed to be the site where she gave birth to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And over the centuries, several different religious buildings have been built in this location, including several different churches and Islamic schools, with the current building first having been constructed by Christian crusaders in the 1100s. It is also the only French national domain that exists within the old city of Jerusalem, with the church being in the Muslim quarter, just inside the Lion's Gate and north of the Temple Mount. In the mid-1800s, the aristocrat Aurélie de la Tour gave the French government the Church of the Pater Noster. She had built the current church next to the much older Sanctuary of Alona, which was first constructed during the Byzantine period. Both structures sit on top of the Mount of Olives, which has been used as an important Jewish cemetery for several thousand years, and was also a central location in the life of Jesus, with Jesus having spent time there with his disciples, and the Garden of Gethsemane at the base of the mount also being the place where he was arrested and taken to be crucified. In 1873, Sultan Abdul Aziz gave the French the monastery of Abu Ghosh as compensation for the Catholic Church losing ownership of the nearby Church of St. George, which had been given to the Greek Orthodox Church. It is the national domain furthest from Jerusalem, and sits next to an old pilgrimage route, with Abu Ghosh having been built on top of an old natural spring and roadside inn. However, over the centuries, it fell into disuse, and was being used as a stable when the French first acquired it in the 1800s, but they were able to restore the building, and they eventually gave it to the Benedictine monks of La Pierre-qui-Vierait. And finally, in 1886, the Pierre brothers, 2 French Jewish businessmen, gave the Tomb of the Kings to the French government. And even though it is called the Tomb of the Kings, it is believed to be the resting place of Queen Helena of Adiabene, a 1st century convert to Judaism who was buried in Jerusalem. Now, the 1900s was another chaotic period for Jerusalem. In 1905, formal relations between France and the Vatican collapsed, as the French formally enacted the separation of church and state. Then, at the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the Ottomans abolished the rights and privileges given to the French almost 400 years ago, formally ending the religious protectorate. But despite all this, the French would continue to push for its existence. A few years later, in 1917, the British gained control of Jerusalem, making this the first time a Christian power controlled the city since the time of the Crusades. But tensions started to rise over what would happen to these Ottoman lands once the war was over, with the nominally Catholic French and Anglican British governments competing over spheres of influence in the Middle East, as well as questioning if the French religious protectorate should even continue. Now, when the Vatican was asked to comment on this dispute, their thoughts would often be split. Initially, they believed that since the French protectorate largely existed to protect Catholics against non-Christian, non-European powers, it wasn't really needed anymore now that these Christian Europeans held sway over the Holy Land. But on the other hand, they did not want a Protestant country controlling Jerusalem. In the meantime, the British largely saw this issue as a geopolitical one, as they viewed the religious protectorate as just a way for the French government to have a foothold in the region under the guise of protecting Catholics. By the end of the war, however, the French finally let go of the religious protectorate in exchange for being given control of the mandates of Syria and Lebanon. But even after the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1922, the French government continued to make a series of agreements with the local authorities ruling Jerusalem in order to maintain ownership of their 4 national domains. This would include the British, the Jordanians, the Israelis, and more recently the Palestinian Authority, with the French continuing to maintain control of these properties, even as ownership of the city has changed from one century to the next. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time. If you'd like to have early access and give feedback on this type of content, please consider joining the Patreon. And as always, thanks to my patrons on Troy and DC. Thank you so much for the support you have given me so far.